I retired, and bought a lake house for peace. My son-in-law said, "My parents are moving in." I didn't argue. I had cameras ready. He never saw it coming. I retired at 63, and bought a lake house in northern Minnesota, so I could finally hear myself think. I'd been there exactly 24 hours. When my son-in-law called and told me his parents were moving in, he didn't ask, he informed me. That was his first mistake. My name is Leonard Whitfield. 37 years, as a structural engineer. I know how things fail. I also know how to build something that won't. The day I signed the papers, I sat across from Patricia Aldridge in her office and wrote my name on every document with the same steady hand I'd used on 37 years of load calculations. 220,000. Every dollar came from brown bag lunches eaten at my desk, skipped vacations, and Saturday mornings spent working while everyone else slept in. Patricia shook my hand and said I was now the owner of one of the finest properties on Lake Vermilion. I thanked her, collected the keys, and felt them solid in my palm the whole drive north. The roads got narrower and quieter the further I went. Highway turned into county road. County road turned into gravel. Cell service dropped from 4 bars down to 1 flickering signal. I stopped at a bait shop outside of Tower and picked up coffee, eggs, bread, and butter. The woman at the register asked if I was living, I told her. She smiled like I'd said the right thing. When the lake finally came through the trees, I pulled over and cut the engine. A great blue heron was standing at the water's edge, still as a fence post. The only sounds were wind in the pines and water against the shore. I sat there for 5 minutes, just breathing. No car alarms. No jackhammers. No neighbor's TV bleeding through the wall. Just quiet. Real quiet. The kind you forget exists after 30 years in the city. The cabin was exactly what the photos promised. Cedar logs, stone fireplace climbing the north wall, wide windows facing the lake. 3 bedrooms that felt like a luxury after decades in city apartments. I unpacked the way I always approached a new project. Methodically, deliberately. Everything in its proper place. Tools hung on the pegboard in the garage. Books arranged on the built-in shelves. Coffee maker on the counter where the morning light would hit it first. By sunset, I had the place set up. I made coffee too late in the afternoon to be smart about it. Carried a mug out to the Adirondack chair on the dock and watched loons move across the water. I called Diane to let her know I'd made it. She sounded genuinely happy for me, said I deserved it. We talked for 20 minutes about easy things. Her 3rd graders, whether she was going to plant a garden this summer, how Gareth had been putting in long hours at the real estate firm. Normal conversation, the kind you have when nothing is wrong. That was day 1. On day 2, Gareth called. I didn't recognize the number at first. I answered thinking it might be the township office following up on paperwork. Leonard. His voice had a specific tone I'd come to recognize over 6 years of him being married to my daughter. The tone that meant he'd already made a decision and was notifying me of it. I wanted to give you a heads up about my parents. Their situation fell through, and they need somewhere to stay for a few months. Diane and I talked it over, and the cabin is the obvious solution. 3 bedrooms. You're 1 person. It's practical. I set down my coffee. You talked it over. I said, with who? Diane and I. She thinks it makes sense. Gareth. I signed those papers yesterday. Right. Which is why the timing works. The place is sitting empty most of the time anyway. There was a pause. And then his voice shifted slightly. My dad has some health issues. They need somewhere quiet and clean. You're not using all that space. And honestly, if you've got a problem with it, you should think about selling and coming back to Chicago, where you can actually be useful to the family. He hung up before I could respond. I sat on the dock for a long time after that. The heron was still there. Hadn't moved from its spot at the water's edge. Here's the thing about being an engineer for 37 years. You don't react to a problem, you assess it. You identify the variables, you account for failure points, and you design a solution that holds. I went inside, made a fresh pot of coffee, sat down at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a mechanical pencil, and started writing. I didn't sleep much that night. That was fine. I had work to do. First thing the next morning, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to the Lake Vermilion Township office. I asked about regulations for long-term occupants and what was required to register additional residents on a property. The clerk explained the rules patiently. Any occupant staying longer than 30 days needed to be registered for emergency purposes, fire response, medical. I asked her to repeat the exact wording twice, and wrote it down word for word. The second call was to Roger Stanton, my insurance agent of 28 years. Roger, I need to go over the policy on my new property, specifically the liability coverage, and anything related to unregistered occupants. Roger walked me through it carefully. My policy covered me as the sole resident. Additional occupants required advance notification. Unauthorized long-term guests could void my coverage entirely. He asked why I was asking. I told him I was being thorough. He laughed and said I was the most careful man he knew. The third call was to Kathleen Mercer. Kathleen Mercer was the only attorney in the area worth talking to. Her office was in tower above a hardware store, with a view of the parking lot, and a wall of filing cabinets that looked like they'd been there since the 1980s. She was around 44, direct in the way that people who grow up in small northern towns tend to be. No small talk, no preamble. I explained the situation without emotion, facts only. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, "Mr. Whitfield, you have every legal right to refuse entry to anyone you choose. This is your property. You have no obligation to house your son-in-law's parents." I asked what happened if they showed up anyway. If they refuse to leave after you've clearly asked them to go, that's trespassing. You call the sheriff. I nodded. I asked her what she would recommend beyond that. She pulled out a legal pad. Document everything, every call, every message, every conversation. If they arrive and won't leave, give them a clear verbal request first, then written notice if needed. If they still won't go, we escalate. She paused. I'd also suggest you have something ready before they arrive, not after. I hired her on the spot. $2,000 retainer. I wrote the check without hesitating. On the drive back, I stopped at Carl Briggs' hardware store in Tower. Carl was a weathered man who knew every item in his store by location, and didn't waste words. I told him I wanted wildlife cameras to monitor deer activity near the property. He walked me straight to the right shelf. Motion-activated night vision. Cellular connectivity sends images directly to your phone. He mentioned that a lot of folks use them for security too. I bought 3 units and a motion-activated light for the driveway. $412 cash. I kept the receipt. I installed all 3 cameras myself the next morning. One on the driveway approach, tucked into the branches of a pine tree, about 8 feet up. One mounted under the garage eave facing the front door. One covering the dock and the boathouse from the corner of the cabin. I tested each one, adjusted the angles, confirmed the cellular connection, and checked that the timestamps were syncing correctly to my phone. Clean sightlines, overlapping fields of view, full coverage. 37 years of structural engineering. I knew how to build something that wouldn't have gaps. I also knew something else. Gareth worked in real estate. He understood property values. He knew exactly what that cabin on Lake Vermilion was worth, and he had decided somewhere along the way that he had a claim to it. The call about his parents moving in wasn't about his parents. It was about getting a foot in the door. I'd seen that kind of calculation before, just never from someone sitting at my own dinner table. I thought about Diane. My daughter had been teaching 3rd grade for 9 years. She loved her kids, called me every Sunday without fail for most of her 20s, and had a laugh that filled whatever room she was in. Somewhere in the last few years, those Sunday calls had gotten shorter and further apart. I'd noticed it, and told myself it was just what happened when people got busy with their own lives. I wasn't so sure about that anymore. The Friday Earl and Pauline Nolan were supposed to arrive. I was on the dock reading when my phone buzzed with a camera alert. I pulled up the live feed. A rental car was coming up the gravel road. I watched it stop in front of the cabin. 2 people got out. Earl Nolan, late 60s, looked around with the expression of a man pricing everything in his field of vision. Pauline Nolan stood next to him, swatted at something in the air, and made a face at the tree line. I met them on the porch. Earl, Pauline. I kept my voice level. I wasn't expecting you. Earl's handshake was brief and businesslike. Gareth said you'd be here. Sorry about the mix-up at the airport. We went ahead and rented a car. There was no mix-up. I never agreed to pick you up, and I never agreed to have you stay here. Pauline's expression went tight immediately. Gareth said this was arranged. Gareth doesn't own this property, I do. And I'm telling you directly that you're not staying here. Earl stepped forward. His voice shifted into a register I recognized right away. The tone of a man who had spent his whole life using it to get what he wanted. Now look, Leonard, let's be reasonable here. We're family. You've got 3 bedrooms, and you're one person in all this space. It's not right to refuse when people need help. I let him finish. Selfish, I said. I worked 37 years for this place. I ate lunch at my desk while everyone else went out. I missed birthdays. I missed holidays. I earned every square foot of this property, and you're standing on my porch calling me selfish for not handing it over to people I've met a handful of times. Earl's face went red. Gareth told us you might be difficult about this. Apparently, Gareth tells people a lot of things. There's a resort about 40 minutes from here. Nice place on the water. I'd recommend it. Please, leave my property. We're not leaving, Earl said. We drove 3 hours from Duluth. We have just as much right to be here as you do. You have no rights here. I own this property. You don't. If you won't leave, I'll call the sheriff and have you removed for trespassing. Pauline grabbed Earl's arm. Let's just go. We'll call Gareth and sort this out. They walked back to the rental car, still arguing with each other. I watched them pull down the driveway and disappear into the tree line. Then I went inside and up the camera footage on my laptop. Every word, every expression, every second of it time-stamped and saved. The phone started ringing within the hour. Gareth called twice within the first hour. I let both go to voicemail. The first message was controlled, annoyed. The second one was not. It ended with, "You think you can humiliate my parents, and there won't be consequences, Leonard. We'll see about that." I saved both messages and forwarded them to Kathleen. Diane called that evening. Her voice had the careful, measured quality of someone who had been coached on what to say. She told me I was being unreasonable. The Gareth's parents were good people who just needed a little help. That I had more space than I needed, and family was supposed to mean something. I listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, I asked her one question. Did Gareth tell you to call me, or did you decide to on your own? A long pause, then, "That's not fair." "I know, honey. I love you, but that's not an answer." She hung up. I sat on the dock until it got dark, listening to the loons, thinking about my daughter and how long it had been since I'd heard her laugh the way she used to. 3 weeks passed. Quiet weeks, but I knew better than to read anything into that. Gareth was not the type to drop something. He was the type to regroup. I used those 3 weeks, the same way I'd used every difficult stretch in my career. I gathered information. I contacted Beverly Holt, a private investigator in Minneapolis that Kathleen had recommended. $300 for a basic background check on Earl and Pauline Nolan, and a general financial overview of Gareth's situation. Beverly was efficient and didn't editorialize. The report came back in 4 days. Earl Nolan had declared bankruptcy 18 months ago. A restaurant investment that had been bleeding money for years before it finally collapsed, leaving behind a civil judgment of $75,000 against him from a business partner. The apartment that Gareth had described to me as needing renovation had not been renovated. It had been foreclosed. Earl and Pauline had been living with Gareth and Diane for 5 months. Not the few weeks anyone had implied. Beverly called me personally to deliver one more detail. "There are financial transfers from a joint account belonging to your daughter and son-in-law," she said, "to accounts in Earl Nolan's name. Over the past 10 months, I'm counting approximately $48,000. I sat down at the kitchen table. "Can you document all of it?" "Already done. Reports coming to you today." I printed the report when it arrived, and added it to the folder I had been building since day 3. Then, I went to the dock, and sat there for a long time. $48,000. That was Diane's money, too. Whatever she and Gareth had been saving together, whatever plans they'd had, that money was gone, and she almost certainly did not know the full picture. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, about 4 weeks after the confrontation with Earl and Pauline, my camera alert went off while I was in Duluth for a routine checkup. I was sitting in the waiting room when my phone buzzed. I opened the live feed.